Hi, my name is Jim Leffler. I was going to do a introduction to mentalization-based therapy as an introduction to our talk on Tuesday. So I'll be talking about various attachment styles or patterns, caregiver attunement, and then principles of MBT and goals of therapy. So I'm actually going to come back to attachment styles and just describe first what is mentalizing. So mentalizing is a mental activity of being able to hold another person in mind. It's a quality and capacity that people use every day, and we generally don't think about it when we use it. So there are three kind of levels of mentalizing: primary, secondary, and tertiary. I'm going to go through each of those in terms of how they relate to the oneself. But the other things that one can mentalize are actually, you can think about it as being the ability to have desires, dreams, fantasy, and your internal life. And that's really what makes this kind of a psychoanalytic concept. And it was very much developed by Peter Fonagy and Mary Target over the last 25 years, with a series of articles starting in 1996 through around 2007 called Playing with Reality. And it's 1 through 7 if I remember right, but I could be wrong about that. So anyway, in I mode, the primary mode is this, like, I'm thinking about myself. And you can see that here with this individual has a sense of who they are and some notion of themselves. The second mode I'm going to call the me mode. It's whenever individual A here has a sense of what individual B thinks about individual A. So A can understand what B thinks about A, which is seen up here inside of B's thought process, and A is thinking all of this. And that establishes an understanding of a me mode. How does someone else perceive me? So I mode, how do I perceive myself? How do other people perceive me? And then there's a U mode that's also this secondary process. And that would be thinking about, just straightforwardly, how does A think about B? And this is in the mental process of U, establishing a U. And then the third one that gets a bit broader, and what one hopes to achieve actually in psychotherapy are the tertiary modes. But before I get to the we mode, which is kind of the goal of mentalization-based therapy in some ways, and not exactly, but in some ways, we'll talk about vicarious mentalizing. Vicarious mentalizing is when character A, let me just demarcate them so you know who I'm talking about, A, B, and C. So when character C tries to understand character A, character C uses how character C thinks character B would think about character A. So character C vicariously uses B to think about A. And then there's the we mode. This is an idea that you come to a shared reality of something, that you've been engaged in kind of mental processes, and now you can kind of think together on some new fantasy all together. So here we have all three characters, A, B, and C, sharing in some fantasy together. Now I've drawn a beach, and if they were just describing the waves and the tree and the beach, that would not be mentalizing. But thinking about some fantasy together where they could run off and live together on the beach, that would be a shared mentalizing reality. And to borrow Fonagy's commentary, they would be playing with reality. Now I'll come back to this in just a second here. So that's mentalizing. Now Fonagy and Bateman borrow a lot of what they talk about from attachment literature. The main figures involved in attachment literature is John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. Some describe them as the father and mother of attachment. John Bowlby was a student of the British object relations theory, and in particular Kleinian theory. Why that's important is because Kleinian theory is highly focused on what are the fantasies that a child may engage in at a very early age of developing who their parents are. John Bowlby, having worked with children who had very difficult upbringings, saw how the environment itself could shape and change a child. When he brought this to the attention of his supervising analyst, Melanie Klein, he felt dismissed by that, and so went off to try to understand from an evolutionary and biological standpoint what is the key function of causing a child to be within a mother. And he thought it was related to security. And so you've heard of secure and insecure attachments and a feeling of security. Mary Ainsworth then followed John Bowlby, initially working as a clinical trials kind of director individual, went on to really develop the clinical trials on her own of how to organize attachment and to demonstrate that it does exist. So John Bowlby always saw himself as an analyst, trying to reformulate what causes a child and a mother to attach, as opposed to kind of the drives, which Freud would have said and Melanie Klein furthered through object relations and fantasy. So through Ainsworth's work, 4 attachment styles or patterns or strategies were developed. Initially, these were thought to kind of carry out through life. We know now that they can change and get shaped. Really, one big way to think about it is you have, I'm going to draw a line here to kind of signify, or you can just think maybe secure versus not secure, everything else being not secure or insecure. What I've drawn here, and I'll just point out, is a self line that goes along the x-axis and an other line that goes along the y-axis. An individual can have a positive and negative understanding of the self. So there's the positive and a positive and negative understanding of the other. If one has a secure attachment, they have both a positive understanding of themselves and a positive understanding of the other. If one has insecure attachment, one of these 2 domains, self or other, will be negative. In the dismissive attachment, which means people are not interested in getting to know others, they devalue relationships, it's also known as hypoactivating. They have a positive sense of themselves, but a negative sense of others. These people tend to be avoidant, that's the other name for this category, and just dismissive of relationships. In the preoccupied category, it's a hyperactivating attachment pattern, meaning they have a negative understanding of themselves, but they're very preoccupied and get overly concerned with the thought of others because they have a positive understanding of others and they want to please others. So they're hyperactivating in their relationships and preoccupied with them. A disorganized attachment is one where the person has a negative sense of self and a negative sense of other and can manifest in any either dismissive or preoccupied fashion depending upon the situation. I should also say, just because someone is typically dismissive, it doesn't mean they can't be preoccupied or vice versa. So that's the attachment styles. So Bowlby thought that these attachment patterns or a secure attachment would be created through thousands of interactions between a child and their caregiver. And over those thousands of interactions, the baby would internalize some sense of self and other and start to live those out. This was further kind of delineated by later developmental researchers, and Fonagy has taken this developmental child research into his incorporation of how someone comes to understand themselves. So walking through the process here, a child has some affective experience, one of the 9 basic emotions. All right, so that's number 2 there. The caregiver can respond to that in 2 ways. And this is not like how do they respond to it one single time. It's how do they respond to it on average over thousands of interactions. And they can respond in either a secure fashion or an insecure fashion. And the 2 places to think about are, does the caregiver mark? And that means when they see the baby, can they say something like, "Oh, baby, I see that you're crying and that you're sad," marking that the parent sees the baby, mirrors the baby, and can tell the baby that they're sad. Then the second, and the insecure form of that would be the not marked, meaning that the child and the caregiver isn't able to really delineate what's my emotion and what's the baby's emotion, or the caregiver gets so distressed by the child's crying that the caregiver actually gets angry. And then the child may internalize, "I'm angry," and not really have a sense of what is their emotional reaction. That would then move on to a non-contingent response. "I'm angry when you're sad." A contingent response would be something, "Oh, baby, I'm sorry," kind of in a mock play of being sad. And then the caregiver takes up the baby, looks at the baby, and calms the baby, gives back the baby's emotion as they gently rock and soothe and care for it. Then the baby is now soothed and placed back in its bassinet or what have you. The baby, in its mind, creates a link between its current digested, metabolized state that it's gotten from the mother, or the caregiver. It doesn't have to be a mother. Forgive me. Any caregiver, primary caregiver. And the baby then internalizes this new digested or metabolized emotional state and remembered it as this affective experience that they had. So it links it. So, caregiver attachment and attunement leads to a digesting of the baby's affective experience through mentalizing, by being able to think about the baby. Is the baby hungry? Is the baby sad? Is the baby tired? This regulates the baby's affect, being mentalized. It's very similar and an extension of Winnicott's holding environment and Bion's container and contained, if you're familiar with those ideas. In our work in mentalization-based therapy, the therapist is the caregiver. So what are the goals of therapy? The goals of this mentalization-based therapy are to get the patient mentalizing, with the thought that increased mentalizing leads to decreased affective dysregulation, which leads to increased epistemic trust and a decrease in epistemic hypervigilance. What those 2 words mean is when the individual approaches the world, do they think of the world as primarily trusting, or do they distrust the world and they have to remain constantly vigilant? If one can increase epistemic trust and decrease epistemic hypervigilance, then this allows for social learning, which ensues outside of therapy. So the goal of mentalization-based therapy isn't that somebody comes to great insights actually within the therapy, but rather that they learn how to trust again, and that they learn how to trust again, and that they can regulate their affects so that they can engage in social learning. And then they'll have thousands of experiences outside of the therapy room that reinforce this learning. So how does one do that? So I'm going to skip over that. Well, the thing I'll talk about today is one of the essential points of mentalization-based therapy is to recognize pre-mentalizing modes. These come out of Winnicott's Play in Reality and then Fonagy's Playing with Reality. This was a book where Winnicott felt like one of the quintessential elements of being a child and being cared for was being able to play, being able to open up a space where one can understand new ideas. Fonagy took this to saying that we can play with reality, and by playing with reality, we can learn new things about it. The three modes that keep us from playing with reality are named by Fonagy as psychic equivalence, pretend mode, and teleological mode. Now, I'm not going to explain right now why he used those terms, but those are technical terms that he defines in his works Playing with Reality. You can think of all of them as low mentalizing states. And psychic equivalence is could also be thought of as a concreteness to thought. Anytime somebody says always, never, I'm sure, they're like this, they're probably operating in this concrete mode. So what I think is equated to the outside world. The opposite of that is going to be, I'm sorry, I called this concrete. I should have said this is equivalence and pretend mode. This is not concrete, sorry, this is certain. When someone's very certain. Teleological mode is concrete. So in order for something to be real, it has to exist in the outside world. So thought does not equal outside world. They're completely disengaged. Things like this are, if you loved me, you'd give me flowers. And we all use flowers to demonstrate love. But in this world, if I was to give you flowers 3 days in a row, I would love you 3 times as much. The last pre-mentalizing mode is the pretend mode. Pretend modes may be the hardest to understand. And this is when people are engaged in lots of content, but not really any change. And this is where there is a disconnect between the thought world and the outside world, where they're completely also disconnected, but there's not even a concreteness that one looks for in the world. In teleological mode, at least we're looking for a concrete reality in the outside world. There is just thought, and there is the outside world, and they're disconnected. Here, there's little thinking, and it's not connected with the outside world, but only this matters. The outside world. In pretend mode, a person's thinking, saying all the things, but their thoughts and comments don't really relate to anything in the outside world. So those are the 3 psychic, pre-mentalizing modes of being. So in mentalization-based therapy, one spends their time trying to determine, are they in a low mentalizing or high mentalizing area? If they're in a low mentalizing space, then you have to help the person restore basic mentalizing or engage in empathic validation to decrease their affective experience, just like the little child here. Decrease the affective experience and allow them to then transition to that space of being like held in the bassinet again. Once they're in the kind of space of feeling safe and secure, then they will be in high mentalizing areas, and you can engage in affective mentalizing and relational mentalizing, which can include transference, countertransference, commentary. So, mentalization-based therapy is based upon being able to recognize low mentalizing, intervene to increase the patient's mentalizing capacity, and once mentalizing, then you can engage content. But content in mentalization-based therapy is actually less important than just getting people to mentalize. There are many more nuances, but that's the basic structure. Low to high mentalizing, hopefully leading to a we mode, where we can then engage in these other forms of mentalizing. This we mode can also be thought of as Ogden's analytic third, if you've heard of that concept, where there's a shared reality and there can be a playfulness between the two. Mentalizing-based therapy is definitely an intersubjective therapy, where both participants are at play and are being influenced. Why would mentalization-based therapy be helpful? I think it is a dynamically informed means of treating severe personality disorders. It has been demonstrated in its earliest studies in 1990, now I'm not sure, I think it's 96. It was shown that nursing staff that were not trained in therapy could provide the therapy with minimal training and weekly oversight. So it can be used in kind of a medium resource way without years and years of training. And that's the second point. It doesn't take years and years of training to execute. You just have to be able to recognize those modes of pre-mentalizing and move towards mentalizing. Well, thank you, and look forward to talking to you soon.